Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, this is Mark Bidwell. Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. If this is your first time listening, a very warm welcome. If you're a regular listener, welcome back. A few months ago, we had an interview with an Indian executive who'd worked in the UK and in the US for companies like Tesco and Walmart. And he was talking about his experience of returning and working for a large Indian company. And because of the feedback we've had around the different perspectives and the value of those perspectives to our listeners, in this case, looking at the world through the lens of an Indian executive in an Indian company, we wanted to continue this theme. And this time we are focusing on innovation in Africa. So on today's episode, we're joined by Jean-Claude Bastos, who is a Swiss Angolan entrepreneur and an executive and an innovation influencer with a deep interest in Africa. He's founder of Quantum Global Group, an investment management firm focused on Africa, and the chair of the African Innovation Foundation, which hosts the annual Innovation Prize for Africa. He's also the founder of Banco Kwanza Invest, which is Angola's first investment bank. And so Jean-Claude is someone with deep insights and experience of doing business in Africa, which is a continent of over 1 billion people, 60% of whom are under the age of 19. And this population is projected to grow to 2.5 billion by 2050, at which point 75% of whom will be under 18. And what he calls essentially the last frontier for innovation. And in our conversation, we discussed how the African Innovation Foundation, launched in cooperation with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, has provided seed funding for almost 10,000 innovators. This is an initiative which has turned $13 million of investment into over $200 million of company valuations. We also explore how the realities of the innovation landscape in Africa and the fact that levels of research and development investment there pale in comparison with those in the West and in Asia, and how these create a specific set of dynamics. And I found our conversation about the innovation ecosystem that Jean-Claude is involved with in Angola particularly interesting. It's called the Soap Factory and includes an incubator, accelerator, co-working space, make it space, and a cultural hub, and how all this connects innovators and investors in that country. Our mission here at Innovation Ecosystem to provide access to multiple perspectives and as a result to change those perspectives. And as I said in the introduction, the interview with Jean-Claude is the second of our podcasts, which is looking at the world, as I say, specifically from an African perspective. So I hope this discussion gives you some fresh perspectives on innovation in Africa and look forward to hearing your feedback. Without further ado, here is Jean-Claude Bastos. So welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem. With me today is Jean-Claude Bastos, who is a Swiss Angolan entrepreneur, an executive and an innovation influencer with a deep interest in Africa. And he's founder of the Quantum Global Group, as well as the African Innovation Foundation, which hosts the annual Innovation Prize for Africa, and also of Banco Kwanza Invest, which is Angola's first investment bank. So Jean-Claude, welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. Pleasure for me to be here and to be invited as a speaker. I'm looking forward to the interview.
So, Jean-Claude, your resume is broad and deep, and I only touched on the highlights, but perhaps to get going into the conversation, how do you answer the dinner party question, what do you do?
Well, I try to simplify and just to say that I'm a private equity player. I'm working in 3 different areas, which is finance, consulting, and real estate. And that I'm an entrepreneur, which is focusing its activities since the last 15 years into Africa, because I'm a big believer that this is the last frontier where a lot can be done.
Okay. And let's get into that, because as you say, you've been active on the continent for many years. One of the things that you founded was the African Innovation Foundation in 2009. And this foundation, amongst other things, runs the Innovation Prize for Africa. So maybe we can start here. What is unique about innovation in Africa, and how is it different from, for instance, innovation in Switzerland?
Mark, let me quickly contextualize this. Africa today has approximately 1.1 billion people, and 60 or more percent of it is 19 and below. And according to various statistics, the demographics should grow from over the next generation. If we take a generation of 30 years, that means that in approximately 2050, we will have 2.5 billion people in Africa, and approximately 70 to 75% are going to be 18 and below. So this is a number which may sound frightening, but could also be seen as a chance. Because if you look at it from the perspective of innovation, one of my dreams, and that was also one of the reasons which I prioritized when I founded the African Innovation Foundation and when I created the Innovation Prize for Africa, I was thinking, what can I do to turn that number and this potential in something very, very positive? And that would be then my kind of contribution to the continent. Mm-hmm. I was looking at this, thinking that the continent looks to me like a very early stage market. There's so much which needs to be done and can be done. There's so much young people which have so much dreams in their heads. So this should be used. Mm-hmm. And when I looked 8 to 10 years ago, when we started to think about the Innovation Prize for Africa, I thought, okay, what is it really what we need to create with this prize? And the answer was quite simple. I need to be able to create the innovation spirit. What does that mean? That means that we have to be able to give hope and believe to the local small community of innovators and try to make that thing become viral and spread it all over so that all young Africans want to be innovators, because that will make a big click in the brain of all young people, because then they will not wait until politicians or programs will change their life, but that they will attack the problems by themselves and seek for solutions and help their communities with their ideas and their creativity. So we have then created that platform, which is a platform where we give about $185,000 as prize money, $100,000 to the grand prize, which is then the winner, $25,000 to the second, and special prize for the highest social impact, another $25,000, and $5,000 to all the nominees which have participated. What we wanted to do with this is to create a perception that innovation in Africa is important and has a value. And with this, we were able to create a platform where we attracted a lot of invisible innovators, because when we started, everybody told us, you guys are crazy. In Africa, there is no innovation. Innovation is not existing, doesn't exist. And now we have, within the African Innovation Foundation, created the biggest database on African innovations in the world. So we have over 9,400 innovators and innovations in our database. And we've been able to create a 30 million investment for the nominees, and this has generated a 200 million valuation only out of these nominees. And this comes from 55 different countries in Africa. And we have then created a kind of a small community of 41,000 followers of this Innovation Prize. So we're quite proud of what we've done. And obviously I can talk much more about this, but I can tell you that it was quite a journey. It was quite exciting to see how much joy and belief we have been able to generate within the nominees and all the people which are participating. And I invite you to come to the next Innovation Prize for Africa to see and live it by yourself, because you will see how much passion the young African innovators have and bring to the table. But I have to say that it has been a very positive journey so far.
If I understand, what you're saying, I think, is that firstly, you started with mindset, you started with tapping into the spirit and the future aspirations of what is a very, very young, continent, essentially. And then secondly, that it's very much almost like a grassroots act or movement that you've spurred and you've fueled with the prizes and the infrastructure around those prizes. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, this is a fair description. I would even say that we have been able to generate that spirit because it even cross-fertilized from the innovators to entrepreneurs, then to the politicians, because we've been able, when we've launched in 2011 the Innovation Prize for Africa and in the partnership with the United Nations, the Economic Commission for Africa, that was for us quite an achievement. And then in 2012, when we had at the Joint African Union and UN-ECA conference, the Innovation Prize for Africa received the endorsement of all these ministers which were there attending, and we managed to pass a resolution with all member states to work with African Innovation Foundation and the prize to promote innovation-based societies in Africa. After that, what has been created, there was a kind of a movement which came out of this resolution because a lot of ONGs, NGOs followed that, and we could really literally feel that in the years after that, we had a lot of NGOs, innovations coming into Africa with all kinds of accelerator, incubator programs, maker spaces, co-working spaces, and all that. It was like we brought a kind of a snowball rolling. Mm-hmm. So that was a kind of a big achievement from our perspective. Another important achievement is that we have signed various MOUs with innovation hubs, and we were kind of instrumental to opening these innovation hubs. For example, the Botswana Innovation Hub, where the president of Botswana then was present at the Innovation Prize and inaugurated. We inaugurated that. We signed with the Academy of Science an MOU, where we have a collaboration with researchers and scientists for grassroots innovation. We have been able to, I don't know if the right word is to motivate the president of Ghana during the Innovation Prize, which we had in Ghana, to make an open statement that he is now giving between 1% to 3% of the GDP for innovation. So there's a lot of things which we've managed to move. So yes, we have generated a spirit, we've generated a movement, we have been instrumental in many decisions and things. We have now generated a kind of a new ecosystem style, which is an incubator, accelerator, co-working space, maker space, and cultural hub in Angola, which is called the Soap Factory. We have launched the Zua Hub, which is a platform to connect innovators in Africa and help them to grow and find investors. So there's many things, and I can even mention more than that, which has been done over this journey where we focused on innovation.
What are some of the myths about innovation in Africa which you would like to dispel or which you're bumping up against, but are myths, if you like?
Yeah, well, I would say that in terms of innovation, I think that people think that Africa is still what sometimes you see in the television when you see the wild animals and when you see all these tribal things and music going around. I think Africa is now a thriving place where a lot of young people have the willingness to work hard and are looking for jobs and are creative. You have a growing middle class. Obviously, you have a lot to do. There's a lot of infrastructure which is missing. There's a lot of education which is missing. But you can feel this willingness that people have to participate into the economical growth. They create more and more companies. You have more and more little young startups. Of course, in comparison with Europe, I would say, in average, you still have quite mid and low level innovation, but there is incredible innovation too, which have even potential in Europe. And I have one innovation which has marked me. There is many innovations which are incredible, but there is one which I have especially looked at a specific African innovation. It's an innovation which is called, the company which is called Agri-Protein, and they won the prize of 2013, and they came out of South Africa. And basically what they invented is a kind of a nutrition product, which is a natural feed for animals. And this is coming out of fly larvae. The fly larvae are fed by biodegradable waste. Mm-hmm. And this feeds then the flies that in turn produce the larvae. And the larvae then are in the ground and they are kind of with a specific system. They are heated and they get dry, and they have a higher degree in protein and provide more ecological friendly, naturally occurring type of animal feed that I have seen in any other product which is around. And this approach really improves nutritional values of meat and lowers the cost of animal feed for African processors and farmers, and in a tremendous manner. And you have to imagine it's a fly farm. And the incubation time is incredibly fast, because if you see that some of our chickens, they eat fish from fish or product coming from fish, and this is totally not natural for chicken. But if you have larves, and specifically in this larves, they are incubated in 8 days. So it's a fast incubating time, and it's high protein, and it's natural, and it's quite simple to do. You have this natural waste, and you have slice. And this is an interesting market. I've seen that they have even started to sell that in China. And one of these innovations which come out of nothing, which can only come out of Africa based on the needs of saving money, and which asks special creativity. I can mention many others, but that's an example of what can come out of African innovation.
That's fascinating. I think one of the best or the most commonly discussed innovations is M-Pesa, the mobile phone money transfer business, which is similar, I guess, to WeChat in China. But one doesn't hear much about innovations that actually are exported from Africa. And I guess I'm curious as to why do you think that is? Because a lot of the innovation, the coverage of emerging markets, if you like, tends to be more around India and China. I'm just curious as to why the lack of interest. Is it because it's earlier stage in Africa than those other markets?
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the reasons that it's earlier stage. But you have to see that also there's a lack of many things, the lack of financing and bringing it to the next level. The fact that you don't have the right infrastructure in place in many African countries is also increasing the price in terms of distribution and logistics. The fact that you have a lot of inefficiency in the market is also artificially increasing the pricing of even local products. I think that Africa has still a long way to go, but I think it's in the right direction now. And we have heard from the Ghanaian president, which has made interesting speech, Africa for Africa. I think it's time for the African people to look out for their own kind of enterprises and to believe in the African enterprise and consume the African products. And it's time that the African entrepreneurs also start to believe in African innovations and start to build that in their R&D, because I can't see a lot of research and development. This is not in the culture of African entrepreneurs yet. And I think this is also a big problem. Obviously, lack of education and lack of equipment in universities where they can have the specific labs where they make the researches. This is also something which lacks. So that makes it a different and difficult journey for local innovators to come out of their embryonal stage and then bring their products to the market. I mean, it's not easy in the Western world, but it's even more difficult in Africa. So that's why we have created these platforms, and that's why we have emphasized also in creating kind of specific ecosystems which have all kind of different levels and layers all in one. So when I mean all in one, I mean to have a co-working space together with a maker space, together with some designing platforms where young designers can come and design, together with incubators, together with accelerators, and then also some spaces for kind of techno-parking approach where you have enterprises which can go and rent some space. And I think the big innovation which we brought to the market is that we've made a bet that we think that innovation has a big attraction into the slums, specifically in Africa, because we believe that the barrier of entry is lower there and the willingness to not give up something and to fight for something is higher, and the pool of young people is quite impressive. I can tell you that we have in our maker spaces and in our courses, which we give, for example, in the soap factory in Kazenga in Rwanda, we have young kids which were not able to almost read. We brought them into 3D printing, and we've showed them to dismantle and build 3D printers and to try to find kind of secondary maintenance tools out of little phones, second-hand or destroyed phones. And they have been able to rebuild 3D printers with spare parts, which they found from television, which they found from phones, within 1 month of training. So I have been amazed, and I'm still astonished by the capacity of these young people and their willingness to learn. They sleep sometimes in this factory just because they are afraid that somebody else comes and take their place. It's incredible.
Sounds a little bit like this concept in India of frugal innovation, the jugaad, where people cobble together from whatever they've got to hand and build out sort of very, very specific solutions to local problems, which don't have any excess features. It's purely solving the problem at hand. It sounds like the ecosystem that you're putting together is tapping into that sort of desire amongst the young, or that capability amongst the young to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is I haven't seen this there, but if this is existing there, then we're following their path, because that's exactly what we're doing. Because we believe that we have to show them that they can do it, because they are afraid of new technology and they see this as a black box. And they don't think that they're able to do something. So we open the box. We train them to not be afraid to touch things and to try to put something in, and having a kind of a learning by experience approach. And then we've seen that this has a tremendous effect in all kind of sectors. So yes, this is what we are doing.
And Jean-Claude, let's switch a little bit to, you started your career as a management consultant. So if we switch to the sort of the more enterprise part of the marketplace, I presume in your, Quantum Global Group, the company you founded, and also the investment bank in Angola, they're less involved in grassroots innovation. They're probably might be more involved in advising multinationals trying to, penetrate these markets, or national companies looking to expand across Africa. And I'm just curious as to, let's take one example. What do you see multinationals, being successful in Africa? What do you see them doing? What are some of the leadership behaviors that are actually working as people are coming into Africa from outside, for instance?
Well, at the multinational level, on the companies which we brought in, or which we advise, or others, I think that the big success factor is always hedging their risks by having bilateral contracts with the governments. That's always something which is important at the big company level, where you have this leverage, and most of the big companies use this leverage, which makes sense. And then where I believe I've seen the biggest level of success is always when the companies teamed up with a serious, sound local partner where they can rely on to resolve problems, to tell them about the difference in terms of the entrepreneurial cultures or perceptions from the government until the employees and a competition, so that they can understand where they may make a mistake and use that as a risk management tool, so that they have a preemptive approach, so that they get more intelligent, smarter in order to not make the mistakes. Because the fact that multinationals are big players and are big job creators, sometimes they have the wrong approach, and then it can turn sour, because then you became vulnerable locally. The people are negative towards that enterprise. I've seen that in different cases. So I think it's very important to have a sound selection process for a local partner, and then also have a very, I would say, patient approach towards the local culture, and make sure that you provide a lot to the local community, and that you create a kind of a loyalty program with the key employees, because the key employees, they get a very quick value in the market, because if you train them, what I've seen in the past is they jump over quickly to other companies which come at a later stage, because they see the first successes. So I think it's important to have a loyalty program for these employees, and to give them a kind of a social safety net, because they don't have this social safety net coming from governments often. So if you have so loyal employees, that's very, very useful.
When you say local culture, up to now we've talked about Africa as one continent, and we haven't distinguished really between countries or between, different ways of doing business, even within a country, like a large country like Nigeria, for instance. I mean, when you say local culture, are you talking at the national level or are you talking at a more micro level?
First, I would say that it's important to understand the national level, but then it's also important to understand the sector, the behavior they had in the past, because sometimes you disrupt some of the local habits and local businesses by coming in. And obviously you push away the local importers and there are maybe long-term business people in the market. So what I mean is you have to understand the culture. I mean, yes, it's a big difference between the countries, because it's a complete but really deep difference to do business in Nigeria and do business in Angola and do business in South Africa. It's all on the same continent, but it's huge cultural difference. A successful South African businessman may not be successful in Nigeria or may not be successful in Angola or may not be successful in Kenya. So there is a huge gap in terms of culture, local understanding the languages which are spoken between the lines. Because I would say it's not like other big cultures or like in China or like in Japan, but I'd say that the difference between one country to another can, and you not understanding that difference can be the key element to the success or to failure.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because, I mean, I was going to dig into this idea of what does effective communication look like in an African country. I mean, to take the example, I mean, in the US or in Germany, people are very, very straight talking versus in India and Japan. And I think what you were just saying just now, in certain parts of Africa, there's far more context, there's far more understanding of what's not being said as part of the communication process. What about leadership? I mean, another sort of spectrum here, I guess, is between egalitarian leadership versus very hierarchical leadership. I mean, how important is hierarchy in organizations in Africa, or is it impossible to generalize again?
Well, I think it depends a little bit of general style of management you want to bring in, but and then it depends on also what country. If you go to countries where they had a kind of a communist past, a kind of a more horizontal approach is probably more welcomed than in another country which had a more business-driven approach over the time. And then it also depends what kind of colonial powers were there. And then it also depends what kind of, I would say, level of or sector you are in terms of business. So I think it's you can't generalize, but I think in order to summarize, communication is important. And if you have an ability to communicate with the community you are in, you can only win.
Yeah. And the final piece around innovation, the leadership behavior, here, Jean-Claude, is around sort of disagreeing, because as we know, much innovation comes from the conversations, between different functions or between different technology providers or between different disciplines or between different approaches, if you like. And I just wonder how disagreement is handled. I suppose here in Europe, countries like Germany and France, confrontation is far more the norm versus in other parts of the world, people go out of their way to avoid confrontation. Does any of that resonate with you in terms of other places where you're active, closer to the avoiding confrontation or more the head-on? I'd imagine South Africa, given the roots to, with the Netherlands, is more confrontational in terms of disagreements.
Yeah, well, it depends heavily on your function and how you deal with problem. But I would say that it's in different countries. I would now not want to generalize because it's again a complicated thing to say. But I'd say that in Africa, people tend to, if they are talking on the peers and at same level, they are very confrontative. They confront themselves to their peers and to their within their collaborative environment. But if it goes to have an approach towards another hierarchy level, I think they are very, very cautious and they don't say what they think.
Yes.
Often because it's very important to have a job there because the unemployment rate is high. So you rather don't say anything because losing the job is a huge problem and can be trouble. It depends what level you have and how important and what your value is in the market, I would say. But in general, they do not really confront themselves with their superiors, but between them, they are quite confrontational.
Yeah. I've seen that on a few occasions I've done business, but I think you put it very eloquently, Jean-Claude. Maybe we can just switch gears to, I sent across a few questions in advance. Maybe we can just go through them very quickly, Jean-Claude. The first one being, what have you changed your mind about recently?
That's a big question, which I was asking myself what I should respond. But I'd say that recently, in the last 2 years, it's a progressive process. I think that I feel that it's more and more important to have a community approach and communicate well with the community. And I have personally a bigger need to share my knowledge with this community, because I can see that you have a higher degree of loyalty which comes out if you are authentically sharing with the community things, and that's I would say something which has recently changed in my mind. And so before I was like me, myself, and I a little bit approach. And now that's a big change, and that's my big personal change.
It's fascinating you say that, because the last two podcast guests that we've had, the interviews I've done, one was with a nuclear submarine commander and the other one was with the founder of Yum Brands, which now runs 46,000 restaurants around the world. They both talked about that as being, a recent insight in terms of what is the most effective model of leadership. So yeah, you're in good company, Jean-Claude. So thank you for that. Second question: where do you go to get fresh perspectives that help you solve problems and make decisions?
Well, I think that it's in line with also, I think that what is very, very important to me, and I believe I can see that with some of my peers, is the approach you have towards a problem. If you have a constant positive approach and a strong belief that what you do is the right thing you do, and you have a clear purpose why you do these things, everything you do becomes light and not complicated. That means every challenge which is in front of you, you have a direct pop-up of solutions. And I think it's really a mind thing. You have to be constantly thinking positive. If you can do that and set your mind towards this positivity, you can see no problems. And that's a very, very strong tool. And that's, I think, my main tool, which I constantly use. I see solutions everywhere. So I don't feel heavy problems or challenges as heavy as some of my peers. I constantly see solutions. And another thing which I'm trying to do more and more, and specifically since I passed my 50s, I try to have more and more fun in what I do. So that goes hand in hand. Positive approach, have fun, stay focused, be light, and also thankful to and grateful to what you have been achieved and to the people which work with you. I think that's probably one of the things which keep me having fresh perspectives constantly.
Yep. Well, we talked, before we started about the importance of fun, and I think that combined with gratitude, which is a very, very powerful and a misunderstood emotion, those two harnessed can get you a long way very quickly.
I agree.
And then finally, a question, around your sort of most significant, I don't want to use the word failure, but low or learning. I'm just curious about what have you taken away? Because clearly not, you do a huge amount, as I said in your resume. Not everything will always go according to plan. Any big learnings, that is there one that you can share that really has turned out to be far more productive, even though it might not have felt like it at the time?
Yeah, there's one thing which happened several times in my career, and it's always hitting me hard. It's hitting me less hard when it happens. It's when I get betrayed by old friends or business people or things. That's always, I think that's the thing which I have always thought, how can they do that? I would never do such a thing. Or I think that's the worst thing which can happen to someone, is be betrayed by people you trust. What I've learned out of that is basically not giving up, to continue to trust, even though that happens. Trust more in my intuitions, and specifically about certain people or behaviors, but also continue when you build enterprises or projects. You cannot, because this happens, starts to mistrust people, but you have to get into a kind of a deeper analysis mood in towards your intuitive senses, which tells you things. I think that's what I've learned over time, and that's the biggest disappointment constantly.
Got it. Well, Jean-Claude, I wanted to thank you very much for your time. I know you're a very busy man. I mean, it's a remarkable story, a very broad and impactful set of activities you're involved in, and I'm sure our listeners will have found this of interest, if only because it's a misunderstood sector of the economy or sector of the geography, and what you're doing is clearly relevant today, but given the statistics and the growth of the demographics in Africa will become increasingly relevant. So wanted to thank you very much for your time, and very much looking forward to meeting you in person.
Thank you, Mark. Same thing here. Anytime. Come to visit Africa. Come to visit one of our ecosystems in terms of innovation which we've created, or visit me in one of my companies. You're always welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Hi, it's Mark again. Now, in the introduction, I mentioned how the changing demographics of Africa alone will create incredible opportunities for innovation. And over the last decade, we've seen, for instance, the enormous impact across the continent of the spread of mobile phones. And in the conversation, we talked about M-Pesa, which has created what The Economist refers to when it describes this company as a bank account in your pocket, lowering financial transaction costs in a way that's fueled innovation across many, many segments of the economy. And Africa has unique challenges, or as Jean-Claude put it, there's so much that needs to be done and that can be done. There's no doubt that the innovation ecosystems that Jean-Claude talked about will have an important role in the continuing transformation of this continent. And my discussions with Jean-Claude also highlighted the risks facing international businesses of the kinds that many of us have worked for or are working for, the risks of viewing Africa in a very monocultural way. It's a continent of enormously diverse history, language, and culture. Doing business in Lagos is very different from doing business in Luanda. In Cairo, it's very different from doing business in Casablanca. And Jean-Claude has built his businesses around creating relationships between international businesses and partners in many of these African markets. So I hope you found this discussion around the different perspectives of real value. Your feedback, as always, is of interest. As I mentioned in the intro, this is the second view from a different part of the world. We started, as I mentioned, with the view from India. The second one here is a view from Africa. And coming up next, we also have the view from Brazil, which I think you'll find of interest as well. And again, what we're doing here is we are giving you access to very different perspectives, which you might not have access to or might not be aware of. So let me know what you think of this. I'm at mark@innovationecosystem.com. You can go to our website and get the show notes and some of the references to this interview and the items that I shared with Jean-Claude. And other than that, have a great week. And this is Mark Bidwell, Changing Perspectives, one podcast at a time.